Just ease it back a little bit. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Read from Śrīmad Bhāgavatam, Canto 3, Chapter 25, The Glories of Devotional Service. Text number 17. Is that right?
Text number 17.
Tada Purusha Atmanam
Tada Purusha Atmanam
Kevalam Prakrite Param
Kevalam Prakriti Param
Nirantaram Swayam Jyotir
Nirantaram Swayam Jyotir
Animanam Akhanditam
Animanam Akhanditam
Tada Purusha Atmanam
Tada Purusha Atmanam
Kevalam Prakrite Param
Kevalam Prakriti Param
Nirantaram Swayam Jyotir
Nirantaram Swayam Jyotir
Animanam Akhanditam
Animanam Akhanditam
Tada Purusha Atmanam
Tada Purusha Atmanam
Kevalam Prakrite Param
Kevalam Prakriti Param
Nirantaram Swayam Jyotir
Nirantaram Swayam Jyotir
Animanam Akhanditam
Animanam Akhanditam
Tada Purusha Atmanam
Tada Purusha Atmanam
Kevalam Prakrite Param
Kevalam Prakriti Param
Nirantaram Shayam Jyoti
Nirantaram Swayam Jyotir
Animanam Akhanditam
Animanam Akhanditam
Ladies,
Tada Purusha Atmanam
Kevalam Prakriti Param
Kevalam Prakriti Param
Nirantaram Swayam Jyoti
Nirantaram Swayam Jyotir
Animanam Akhanditam
Animanam Akhanditam
Tada Purusha Atmanam
Tada Purusha Atmanam
Kevalam Prakrite Param
Kevalam Prakriti Param
Nirantaram Swayam Jyoti
Nirantaram Swayam Jyotir
Animan
Animan Akhanditam Animan
what happened?
Tada Purusha Atmanam
Tada Purusha Atmanam
Kevalam Prakriti Param
Kevalam Prakriti Param
Nirantaram Swayam Jyoti
Nirantaram Swayam Jyotir
Animanam Akhanditam
Animanam Akhanditam
Tada.
Tada
Then
Purusha
Purusha, the individual soul.
the individual soul
Atmanam,
Atmanam
himself. Kevalam,
Kevalam
pure. Prakriti
Param
transcendental to material existence.
transcendental to material existence
Nirantaram,
Nirantaram
non-different.
non-different
Swayam Jyoti,
Swayam Jyoti
self-effulgent.
self-effulgent
Animanam,
Animanam
infinitesimal.
infinitesimal
Akhanditam,
Akhanditam
not fragmented.
not fragmented
At that time, discuss later. At that time, the soul can see himself to be transcendental to material existence and always self-effulgent. Never fragmented, although very minute in size. Purport: in the state of pure consciousness or Krishna consciousness, one can see himself as a minute particle, non-different from the Supreme Lord. As stated in Bhagavad Gita, the jiva, or the individual soul, is eternally part and parcel of the Supreme Lord. Just as the sun's rays are minute particles of the brilliant constitution of the sun, so a living entity is a minute particle of the Supreme Spirit. The individual soul and the Supreme Lord are not separated as in material differentiation. The individual soul is a particle from the very beginning. One should not think that because the individual soul is a particle, it is fragmented from the whole spirit. Mayavad philosophy enunciates that the whole spirit exists, but a part of it, which is called the jiva, is entrapped by illusion. This philosophy, however, is unacceptable because spirit cannot be divided like a fragment of matter. That part, the jiva, is eternally apart. As long as the Supreme Spirit exists, his part and parcel also exists. As long as the sun exists, the molecules of the sun rays also exist. The jiva particle is estimated in the Vedic literature to be 1/10,000th the size of the upper portion of a hair. It is therefore infinitesimal. The Supreme Spirit is infinite, but the living entity or the individual soul is infinitesimal, although it is not different in quality from the Supreme Spirit. Two words in this verse are to be particularly noted. One is nirantaram, which means non-different, or of the same quality. The individual soul is also expressed here as animanam. Animanam means infinitesimal. The Supreme Spirit is all-pervading, with a very small spirit is the individual soul. Akhandita means not exactly fragmented, but constitutionally always infinitesimal. No one can separate the molecular parts of the sunshine from the sun, but at the same time, the molecular part of the sunshine is not as expansive as the sun itself. Similarly, the living entity, by his constitutional position, is qualitatively the same as the Supreme Spirit. but he is infinitesimal. Om Ajnanatimidandasya Jnanasakaya Chakshurumilitam Jena Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Stapitam Jena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadam Svabadantiyam Mukam Karoti Vacham Mukam Gayate Yatriva Namam Padare Shri Guru Nitayam. At that time, in which the consciousness of the living entity is attached to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. When one is, and the word here is kevalam. Kevalam. Not mentioned in the translation actually, that word, pure. Right? And so that means, from the previous two verses, connected to Krishna. Ratam va pupsi muktaye. Ratam, attached. Right? We say, don't be attached. No point in being attached to anything in the material world, because the material world is temporary. And so things are always in a state of flux or flow. But one should be attached to Krishna, because that's our eternal connection. Our eternal relationship is to be always connected to Krishna under the influence of the external energy, Bahiranga Shakti, three potencies, Antaranga Shakti, Bahiranga Shakti, Tatashta Shakti. Where the Tatashta, the marginal energy, we can be influenced by the spiritual or by the material. Or a mixture of both. But when one's ratam va pumsi muktaye, one's liberated from the material conception, and one becomes attached to the spiritual conception under the shelter of the spiritual potency, then one is in a position to realize the true nature of one's self. And the symptoms of that here, Kapila is explaining. One, and it is mentioned here, Kevalam, one is pure. And in yesterday's verse, Bhaktivedanta was discussing, is described one of the characteristics of that purity. Kama, Loba, Adibhi, and so on. aham mameti, or aham mama abhimana utai, one's free, vitam is the word here, free from the impurities, malai, of thinking I am, this is me, the body, and things connected to the body are mine. And from that misidentification comes calm, krodh, lobh, or here it just mentions lust, greed, and the enemies of the mind. Yeah? So the mind becomes purified from this conception of aham, ameti, I and mine, and one understands we should understand our spiritual identity. And in that, and so here's what happens. What's been described here. Tada, Purusha, Atmanam. And then the characteristics, the qualities of that consciousness, or that state of self-realization. Kevalam, pure. Prakriti Param, above the influence of the material energy. Nirantaram. And Prabhupada translates Nirantaram as non-different, or of the same quality. Swayam Jyotiya, self-effulgent. Animanam, very, very small. Akanditam, Prabhupada translates that as not fragmented. Not fragmented. So, the first verse that Prabhupada quotes or paraphrases in this purport is Mam Evam Sa Jiva Loke Jiva Buddha Sanatana. As stated in Bhagavad Gita, the Jiva, or the individual soul, is eternally part and parcel of the Supreme Lord. Mam Evam Sa Jiva Loke Jiva Buddha Sanatana. So eternal. Always in a relationship with the Lord. Non-different from in quality. Right? Prabhupada always gives this example. Non-different in quality, but Animanam. Right? Very, very, very small part of the Supreme. Same in quality, but not the same in quantity. So there is a difference. And that's our philosophy. Atintya Bheda Abheda Tattva. We're the same as God, but we're different from God. Just in case, just in case we get carried away with ourselves. Yes, I'm the same as God. And the example Prabhupada gives here, just as the sun's rays are minute particles of the brilliant constitution of the sun, so a living entity is a minute particle of the Supreme Spirit, and that's why it's described here as Swayam Jyoti, or brilliant, self-effulgent. You can see that effulgence. How do we perceive the effulgence of the living entity? through the material elements? How do we perceive the effulgence, the brightness of the Spirit in others? How do we do that? Huh? Don't know. Good. Sorry? Speak, I've got my hearing aid on. You have to speak loudly.
We look at the difference between a living and a dead body.
See if they're alive.
No.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Because the living body already is much more vibrant than a dead body. So
That's right. Yeah. See the light in their eyes. Huh? Sparkle. Everybody's got a bit of it, because at this stage of the day we might be feeling a little getting close to breakfast time after a Ekadasi. So the effulgence might not be so self-effulgent. Sometimes also you can see the effulgence, especially in the devotees. You can see the effulgence. Huh? They've got this sort of kind of glow. Where's that glow come from? Ultimately it comes from Krishna, but because the spirit soul is in quality the same as Krishna, so therefore that effulgence is manifest or observed in a person who's on the transcendental platform. There's an attractiveness and an effulgence that's observable in the being, in the presence of a devotee who's situated on the transcendental platform. They're enlivened. They're enlightened and enlivened as a consequence of that enlightenment. And there's a certain power and potency that is observed in the character of a person who's on this platform of spiritual self-realization. They're able to tolerate the comings and goings of the material energy because they're connected to their spiritual identity, and their relationship with Krishna is established. And that's when these qualities are manifest. Huh? Even though we have the same qualities, and so therefore can be said to be one with God, right? One with the Supreme. At the same time, what's been pointed out here is that we're also different. But not a separation in terms of material. Well, Prabhupada, it's very interesting what Prabhupada says here. The individual soul and the Supreme Lord are not separated as in material differentiation. Right? There's a separation, but it is not the kind of separation that we experience in material existence. So, on the one hand, we're individuals, and so therefore can be understood as being separate from the Lord, but at the same time, this is the spiritual realm, but at the same time, even though there's separation, there's still, it's not based on material separation, but rather there's still a spiritual connection between the Lord and his parts and parcels. It's not a material separation. Not a material differentiation. And so, what in the beginning, in the Bhagavad Gita, is, he doesn't have a beginning, there's no end, doesn't come into being, but we're eternal. And even though we're eternal and we have our own separate identity, part of that identity, and this is self-realization, self-realization is to understand that yes, I have my identity, but part of my identity is to be connected with Krishna, or to be connected with the Lord. So we have our identity, and we are separate, in one sense, but not from the material perspective. From the spiritual perspective, separate, but at the same time connected to Krishna. And that connection is based on what? What's our connection with Krishna based upon?
Love, prem.
At the highest level, yes, but at the basic level, what is it based on?
Devotion servant.
And what does that mean? We're a servant. We're servants. That's our dharma.
Jiva by Krishna Nityadas.
Yes. Nijera Krishna Das. We're always a servant. But at the moment we're in the impure state. We're servants of the material conception of existence. And that is real separation. That's material separation. When they're living, Prabhupada explains, when the living entity comes into the material world, then he wants to be the enjoyer and the controller. And as a consequence, because that's a false identity, then the spiritual identity by the laws of, by universal laws, when one wants to become the enjoyer and the controller, that state of consciousness is false, it's illusion. And so our original spiritual identity gets covered over, has to be covered over, in order to facilitate that sense of identity as a competitor, basically, with Krishna. He's the supreme controller. We are the servants of the supreme controller. But when we try to exercise this false, so it's a ahankara, this false sense of I am the doer, I am the enjoyer, I am the controller, we have to give up our sense of servitorship. But that servitorship is the basis of our relationship with Krishna. And we always have a relationship with Krishna, but we want to forget that relationship. We have to forget that relationship in order to try to be the enjoyer ourselves, the controller, and it's just an illusion. So, in awareness of our original identity in that pure state, not then under the influence of material energy, then we see these qualities manifest, non-different. Swayam Jyotit, self-effulgent. Along with that enlightenment comes happiness, freedom from anxiety. Right? Sure, there are problems, but they come and go. Right? Today there's a problem, tomorrow it's solved. Tomorrow there's success, the next day another disaster. Right? There's material existence. Animanam, infinitesimal. Akhanditam, not fragmented. So that's a critical point here, Prabhupada's explaining. Part and parcel. So, separated, but not separated. That's almost, that requires, these concepts, these concepts require some meditation, some contemplation in order to fully appreciate. And they require some purity. So long as we're influenced by that false ego, that desire to enjoy separately from Krishna, then one can't understand one's original pure spiritual identity. And that's why we have to cultivate this mood of service. Prabhupada describes bhakti as devotional service. Right? And service means doing things. Right? Not just sitting around thinking about it, but actually doing it. And service requires what? Hearing first. Right? One has to listen. That's how we find out what service we should be doing. Right? What service would you like me to do? What was that? Huh? Shravanam, yeah, the beginning of devotion. Shravanani sutta chitte karaye udoye. Our natural love for Krishna is within the heart, within us. It is us, actually. But it's covered over by this desire to want to be separate from the Lord. And the Lord tests us. You know how the Lord tests us? He tests our sincerity to know Him by getting us to serve His devotees. Right? And that's how our original relationship, which is, it's already there. Our relationship with Krishna is part of us, as it is mentioned here. It's part of us. But it's covered over. And we uncover it by doing service. And that service to the devotees in the form of the spiritual master. But then the spiritual master says, well, you work with the other devotees. Right? That way we become humble. But interestingly, see, the thing is, Krishna is so powerful and potent that He's connected to His devotees. He loves His devotees. And so when we serve the devotees, even the little devotees, then Krishna is very attracted to and pleased by that mood of service. Because that's starting to bring out our natural identity. That's the Kevalam, that's the purity of a bhakta, is that he's a servant of the, just like when Śrīmad Prabhupada there was an interview in Chicago or somewhere in America, and Prabhupada was explaining the Varnashram system, the 4 different classes. And the interviewer asked Prabhupada, he says, and what are you? You're the topmost person in that, in that arrangement? Prabhupada said, no, I'm the 5th class. The 5th class is a servant of all of the other classes. Right? And the Guru basically is a servant of his disciples. Right? In that he provides transcendental knowledge and service. He facilitates service of the disciple, or to disciple, gives service to the disciple, and in the pursuance of that service, then one's spiritual identity is re-established, reawakened. That's how we, and of course that begins with hearing and chanting. Hearing, first and foremost. And so we're told, continually, we're reminded of these points. You're not the body, you're a spirit soul. Right? Because we're so caught up in a bodily conception, identification. But the real identification is separate from this body. We're a spirit soul, and what are the characteristics of the spirit soul? Jivera Svarupa Hoy Nityena Krishna Das. He's a servant. And so the perfection of this realization, this understanding, is manifest in our devotional practice, and that devotional practice, that we have our constitutional activities and we have our conditional activities. Conditional activities means those activities that are related to this body. And the constitutional activities are the activities related to our spiritual identity. So our sadhana, the constitutional activities of the spirit soul, reawakens that identity. And when our sadhana is strong, beginning with the hearing and chanting, then our conditional activities are supportive of our constitutional activities. We have to eat, we have to sleep, we've got to evacuate. All these things are all conditional activities, but when they're supportive of our constitutional activities, our service ultimately to Krishna, then they become also spiritualized, spiritual activities, because they support the basis of this understanding that is, I'm a servant. So, and in that state of servitude, then these qualities will manifest. One will realize one's true identity. Animanam akanditam, very, very small. And akanditam, not fragmented, not separated from Krishna. And when one realizes one's animanam, then what qualities manifest in one's character? Humility, yeah. Humility is a characteristic of a devotee. Not that, now I'm so advanced, or I'm so full of knowledge, I'm a big devotee. Huh? But the characteristic is humility. Animanam. That even though I'm able, and we may be endowed with many qualities and potencies, able to do so many things, but that Krishna says, I'm the ability in man. So the devotee appreciates and recognises that whatever empowerment he or she may have, ultimately it's coming from Krishna. And akhanditam, there's no separation between the devotee and the Lord, especially when there's service. Prabhupada mentions that. What is it? He lives forever by his divine instructions, and the follower lives with him. So in spiritual life and in spiritual activities, when one follows the instructions of the spiritual master, then one's with the spiritual master. And there's no feeling of separation. When one's rendering service to Krishna in the right mood, in the right mentality, then there's no feeling of separation from Krishna. There's a feeling of connection. In material existence, when we're separated, then there's pain, dislocation. But when one's engaged in devotional service, one is connected again. Even if there's some distance materially. Now Prabhupada said, I never felt separated, I don't feel separated from my Guru because I'm following his instructions. So, these are some of the characteristics, qualities of the soul, or the living, what is it? Ratamba Pumsi Muktaye, the realized soul who's connected to, freed from material affection, attraction, and is connected to the Lord through the activities of devotional service. This chapter is called The Glories of Devotional Service. This is what happens when we're engaged in devotional service, when we're acting truly as a servant. Then these elements of self-realization, these qualities or characteristics, will automatically will be manifest in our personalities, in our behaviours, in our self-identification. The self-identification is no longer ahamameti, I am this body, what's related to the body is mine, but rather the prakriti param, transcendental to the material energy. This is the potency of devotional service, can uncover these natural qualities and characteristics of our spiritual identity, of who we really are. Okay, does anybody have any comments or questions?
I can think of example of Swayam Jyotir. When Shishupal's head was cut with the Sangarshan Chakra, everybody could see the soul traveling and entering Krishna.
Yeah.
Classical example of
Because he was a demon, I guess. So he wanted to become, he was envious of Krishna, wanted to be Krishna basically, so he got the opportunity and he was merged into the body of the Lord.
abusing all the time Krishna.
So yes, a bit of effulgence there, but ultimately he he's the epitome of envy. And Krishna tolerated him.
You must
While studying the characteristics of the soul, one of the points is he doesn't have a past, present, or a future. He is eternal, ever existing. Now, how do we understand that he doesn't have a present? Like past and
Okay. I think we looking from the material perspective, we find three phases of existence. Huh? Past, present and future. And that's our identification. That's our material identification. So we can understand from the descriptions of the Shastra that the existence of the living entity is beyond those three phases of existence, where beginnings, middles and ends don't make sense. Now, that's very hard for us to conceive of. Something separate from our current existence in the spiritual manifestation or in the spiritual setting. So, very difficult for us to conceive of that spiritual presence. And so, there must be some sense of being, right? And the only way we can appreciate that sense of being is in the present. Right? From those descriptions we can understand that the spiritual the sense of spiritual identity is beyond past, present and future, and that's HG at this point in our existence. Inconceivable. HG Rupa. Inconceivable form. The form of the living entity. Krishna's form is inconceivable. The form of the living entity is also inconceivable. It has to be experienced. So, there is some sense of presence in spiritual being. Otherwise, it's not being. It is some sense of being. But not like the material conception. That's my explanation. Too hard to, it has to be experienced, difficult to describe. But there must be some sense of presence. Must be. Otherwise you wouldn't exist. Anything else? Prabhuji?
You mentioned when you are serving Krishna, then there is no separation.
Yes.
How do you understand when gopis felt separation from Krishna when he went to Mathura?
Well, see, that's the example that's given in proving that point, that there's no separation. Their meditation on Krishna was so intense that they felt as if he was present. Right? So, when in our meditation on Krishna, in our remembrance, this is why Shravanam Kirtanam is so important, because that then fuels or reawakens our remembrance of the Lord. And when we're able to remember Krishna, and there are different levels, it's described in the Nectar of Instruction. and in other places, the different levels of meditation, right? And so that remembrance deepens and deepens such that one is fully conscious of one's spiritual identity, and one becomes detached from the material identity. And so one's existence in samadhi and beyond is such that one completely forgets the material body and becomes absorbed in one's nitya siddha relationship with the Lord. That's what samadhi is called, right? And we saw it you see it in the lives of in Bhaktivedanta, or for example, where at the end of his life he just sequestered himself from the rest of society and just was absorbed in his well, not even in India. I guess you could say sadhana, but it wasn't sadhana for him. It was his nitya lila relationship with Krishna and the residents of the spiritual world. You see that in Raghunath Das. So when there's that deep absorption, that purity of spirit, or the purity of self-realization in an advanced devotee, there is no feeling of separation. They're so deeply self-realized that they've left the material world, even though the material body's still there, the spirit soul's not. It's completely detached from the workings of the body, which is what's mentioned here. And in the next verse, he becomes indifferent to material existence, and the material influence acts less powerfully upon him. Right? Very deep. And you know, our performance of devotional service is meant to uncover our spiritual identity, site.The. And our activities are to be performed where there's always that constant remembrance of Krishna. This is the goal. Right? Deep absorption. Prabhupada explains in the Nectar of Instruction how if we follow the process of devotional service and we come to the platform of goodness, then our spiritual identity and our relationship with Krishna will automatically be revealed. That's a deep meditation that goes on within the heart. And he explains how Rupa Goswami explains how one will follow in the footsteps of the residents of Vrindavan. To whom one is attracted will be revealed as part of our devotional practice. Prabhupada says automatically revealed. Prabhupada says the Guru will reveal it, the spiritual master will reveal it. From the text of the Upadeshamrita, the Nectar of Instruction, from Prabhupada's explanation, that's an internal, that's a process or a practice that's going on internally. Our internal meditation. So when that meditation deepens, then the sense of separation from Krishna is removed. Right? That's why we have the external practices of devotional service, but really the external practices is to uncover and to realise our spiritual identity. That's going on internally. We're separated. We're not this body, right? So then, who are we? Well, we're a servant. But then that identity of our original spiritual position, our original spiritual personality, it has to be uncovered. When that's uncovered, in part of that uncovering process is to become more and more connected to Krishna. So there's that sense so that sense of separation is dissolved. Now, in the gopis are the pinnacle of, or the epitome of devotional practice, in that they were separated from Krishna physically, we could say, but actually they weren't separated from Krishna because of their close meditation, deep meditation. Their affection and love for Krishna was so strong that they never forgot him. And so in that meditation of never forgetting Krishna, they were at the same, they were simultaneously separated but not separated. Right? Vipralamba Seva is considered to be the highest, that's the highest of connections with the Lord, is to be so deeply absorbed in Him that even in separation there's not separation. That is paradoxical from the material perspective. A lot of what the devotees do is paradoxical. Hard to understand, very deep. Hamaji?
What Anmol is saying is, and you are explaining, Krishna Karshini, like milk.
Attracts Krishna.
Yeah, Krishna Karshini.
Yeah.
It's like milk, you make rowdy, so thick, syrup becomes like rowdy. In Hindi they call it.
Like
By Vrindavan.
Yeah.
Govardhan.
Yeah, the relationship is so
Intense.
deeply felt.
Unbreakable.
Yeah. It's like, I was thinking about my mum. I don't usually think about my mum. Right? But I was thinking about my mother the other day, how she used to fold our socks. And Chicharipa said to me, "Oh, you're thinking of your mum." And I hadn't thought of it, but I was thinking of my mum. And how, she showed her affection for us by folding our socks in a particular way. Right? Not everybody does it. You know how she would do it? She would, it's hard to explain, but you turn the socks inside out. Right? Then you put your hand in and you pull the front of the sock back to the heel. Right? So that when you put your sock on, you just put your sock into the foot of the sock, but then you just pull it makes it very easy to put your socks on. Right? And I was doing something that I don't usually do very often, but I brought in the washing without being asked to. And so I was folding up the socks. And then I remembered how my mum used to do the socks. So, there's, and then I realised, because it takes a bit of effort, there's an easy, you just get the socks off the line and scrump them up and put them together. But if my mum took the effort to put the socks in such a way so they're very easy to put on, And in that way she showed her affection for us. And I remember that. Just a natural remembrance of your mother. So that relationship between the gopi, not my relationship with the Bobs, that transcendental. But it's an example where you think of that person, right? Just naturally think of that person because of the affection they show for you.
Lord Krishna was doing the same thing.
Krishna
He
was
was
following
taking
socks.
shoes of Nand Maharaj
Yeah.
on his head.
I was bringing the shoes for Nanda Maharaj. Yeah. Yeah. Not exactly the same thing, but service, yes.
Similar.
Yes, similar. Mood of service. And mums are like that, they just like to serve. When we used to go and visit my parents,
And
when I was living in Brompton, my mum would always, she would, when we were there, she always wanted to do the washing. I hate doing the washing, right? But that's what she wanted to do, just do some service. Can't stop themselves. Huh? When you go home, what does your mum do? You Vera Chandra. You got a mum, haven't you? What does she do? She wants to feed you. Yeah, my mum wanted to feed me all the time. And we wouldn't let her cook. She was really upset because we wouldn't let her cook. But then what she would do is, when the Chinchurika was cooking, eventually what happened was, she would help a Chinchurika cook. And she was happy with that. She would do some cutting up. So that kind of affection, that service makes the connection, right? Even if there's separation, there's that connection still. And deeply realized Krishna consciousness, samadhi and beyond, is there's no feeling of separation. All right, let's finish here, shall we? Control Śrīmad Bhāgavatam ki jai, Śrīmad Prabhupada ki jai. Onward march, back to Godhead ki jai. Samadhi, now what is it Prabhupada says? Work now, samadhi later.